Well, hey there. It's 7:30, which means it's time for us to get started. Hope you guys are having a great evening. We are just merely, 6 days away from the AP exam. So it's time to really start getting serious and talking about what needs to be done and what do we need to know and stuff like that. Tonight, I'm going to be going through time period 4. Time period 4 basically covers the years of 1800 to 1848. It starts with the election of Jefferson, also known as the Revolution of 1800, and it will continue all the way to 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention. So we're gonna dive right in and get going on this stuff. And actually, my PowerPoint is off, so let me get this back up real quick. And I think we're ready to go. Let me change this and boom, there we go. All right, so tonight our big ideas are going to be covering things such as the territorial expansion of the United States, the growth of our democratic reforms, and the growing sectionalism that we'll see during this time period. One thing that's going to come into play is the market revolution. The market revolution essentially is when America established itself as economically independent from the rest of the world. And finally, we're going to see a huge movement during this time period where we're starting to look at Americans taking responsibility for their society. So we're going to look at the growth of the reform movement that spread from the Second Great Awakening. So if you guys are ready, we're going to dive right in. So, boom, Jefferson's presidency. Like I said, this time period starts with the election of Jefferson or the Revolution of 1800. What is so important about this particular election is essentially we see a peaceful transfer of power going from the Federalist Party to the Democratic Republicans. And this is the first time we've seen this in history, essentially, where no shots are fired, no fighting goes on, but we just transfer power from one political ideology to the next. Jefferson is going to come in with a different viewpoint of America and how America should basically operate. He's coming from the agrarian standpoint where he believes the economy should be based on agriculture. And so that's going to motivate a lot of his decisions. Now, some of the first things he does when he comes into office, number one, he's going to reduce the size of the military. Then he's going to repeal the Alien and Sedition Acts. If you remember, the Alien and Sedition Acts were passed during the Adams administration, and that's essentially going to be the center of the election of 1800. And as soon as Jefferson takes office, he will repeal that. What Jefferson is probably most well known for is the Louisiana Purchase, in which he bought this land from France and essentially doubled the size of the United States, which makes sense because wanting an agrarian-based economy, we want more land. And that was the goal when he bought Louisiana, was to extend the amount of land that we had in order to extend our agricultural power. But what that did was it completely contradicted his view of how to interpret the Constitution. If you remember, Jefferson believed in a strict interpretation of the Constitution, and there was nothing in the Constitution that essentially allowed for a president to go out and make this massive real estate deal. But he did it, and we're now twice the size that we once were. Probably one of the biggest, I don't know if it, he is going to have some military conflicts. One of those conflicts is going to be over in the Mediterranean, where we're essentially going to fight a war with the Barbary pirates because he refused to pay them a larger tribute than previous presidents has. So he's going to have to deal with that, and that's kind of tough when he's reduced the size of the military during when he first comes into office. A minor, honestly, it's not a major war or anything, but you want to be familiar with it at least, knowing that comes from Jefferson's presidency. The Louisiana Purchase was a result of Napoleon really reacting to the Haitian Revolution down in Haiti. Our American Revolution inspired a lot of other revolutions, including the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution occurred when the slaves rose up against the ruling class in Haiti and actually took over and took power. So Napoleon's ready to kind of offload the rest of the land in North America so he can focus on his war that he's fighting with England or over in Europe. Now, once we get the land, we're going to send our buddies Lewis and Clark out to explore and try to find a route, a northwest passage to the Pacific Ocean. They're going to be joined by a lot of different explorers, one of them being Zebulon Pike. If you've ever been to Colorado, Pikes Peak is named for Zebulon Pike. And again, like I said, the whole purpose of the Louisiana Purchase in Jefferson's mind was to promote this agrarian vision that he had for our country, to promote the idea of these small independent farmers building our nation. So that's kind of what was the, the motivating factor behind all this. A major event or major events that are going to happen during Jefferson's presidency is the establishment of the power of the Supreme Court. It started with the case of Marbury v. Madison in 1803. And from that case, we got the precedent of judicial review, which essentially established the Supreme Court as the power behind interpreting the Constitution. If you remember correctly, going back to Adams' presidency, states were trying to interpret the Constitution, and that was the basis of the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. Well, now John Marshall and his court is saying, no, it is the Supreme Court's duty to interpret the Constitution as it lines up to the U.S. Constitution. We're going to see John Marshall in a number of Supreme Court cases throughout time period 4, another one being McCulloch versus Maryland, which essentially established the supremacy of the U.S. Constitution and the supremacy of the federal authority. We'll see him in Gibbons v. Ogden. In that case, they talk about the power of interstate commerce that is held by Congress under Article 1, Section 8. We're later going to see him make a decision in Worcester versus Georgia during the Jackson administration, in which he declares that Native American tribes are independent nations and thereby under the jurisdiction of the federal government. So he's going to make a lot of decisions, and really what you need to understand about the Marshall Court is, one, not only does it strengthen the judicial branch, but pretty much with every single decision he makes, it strengthens the power of the federal government. So the federal government's power and influence is going to grow under or through a lot of the decisions that Marshall is going to make during his tenure as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Next, we want to talk about the rise of nationalism in our country, and that is going to be a direct result of the War of 1812. Now, Jefferson, his second half of his tenure as president, so his first term, he has the Louisiana Purchase, big win. Coming into his second term, what's going to happen is we're going to see him actually kind of recoil back and have a negative second term because he's dealing with a lot of problems with Great Britain. Great Britain is in this war with France, and they are essentially taking over or taking our freedom of the seas. They're impressing our sailors. They're taking our ships here in North America. Even though they signed the Treaty of Paris of 83, they still have not left their forts on the western frontier. And so they've built alliances with Native Americans. They are starting to, arm the Native Americans. Before, we actually go to war, Jefferson tries to curtail the power of Great Britain by essentially passing the Embargo Act. And the Embargo Act stopped all trade. America said, well, since we're having all these trouble, with our ships being impressed and stuff like that, we'll just stop trading with everyone. Well, in doing that, we see our economy tank, especially in New England. So this is going to lead into the next president, which is James Madison, and he's going to have to deal with all this. Now, he tries to repeal the Embargo Act. He tries to pass other legislation like Macon's Bill No. 2 and stuff like that in order to rejuvenate trade coming out of America. But by this point, it's almost too late. The War of 1812 is going to essentially start when it's discovered, as I said, that the British were arming the natives on the western frontier. You couple that with the impressment of our sailors, the war hawks in Congress, we declare war on Great Britain. Now, the War of 1812 doesn't really produce a whole lot of anything. Our White House gets burned down. We get a new national hero in Andrew Jackson, but essentially nothing changes in America. The Treaty of Ghent is going to be signed, and we're going to go into what was called status quo or antebellum status quo. And the treaty essentially said we're just going to go back to the way things were. But In America, the news of the treaty reaching America hit the shores at about the same time that Andrew Jackson won the Battle of New Orleans. And so there was this instant image that America had won this war against Great Britain. And so you're going to see this surge of nationalism sweep across our country. And sometimes it's referred to as Ghent nationalism, tied to the Treaty of Ghent. Now, while this is happening, as I mentioned, the people in New England were really hurt economically by the embargo, by this war. And so you're going to see a group of Federalists form the Hartford Convention, in which they are going to start talking about amendments they want to the Constitution. And within their talks, they mention the word secession. As a result of that, the Federalists are going to get a bad rap in our country, and you're going to see the decline of the Federalist Party. So the causes, again, of the War of 1812 are going to be British impressment of our sailors, as well as the fact that they are arming Native Americans on the western frontier. However, the effects of the war are probably more predominant. The Hartford Convention leads to the end of the Federalist Party. You see a surge in nationalism in our country. You see a rise of an American hero in Andrew Jackson. And probably the biggest effect of the War of 1812 is America is going to become economically independent. Meaning that we're going to start manufacturing our own goods. We're no longer going to rely on sending our raw materials overseas and having their manufacturing. We're going to start manufacturing here. Now, once we started manufacturing and once we saw our economy grow, we knew we needed more infrastructure. We needed more connection within our country. And so what you're going to see happen is Henry Clay, in Madison's presidency, then carrying over to Monroe's presidency, is going to introduce the American system. Now, the American system had three key components. It had transportation, it had tariffs, it had a national bank, and it had infrastructure. The way I always remember it is I say BIT, B-I-T, bank, infrastructure, tariff. And what these three things did coming together was they tied the three regions of our country together, tied the North, the South, and the West together economically. We became interdependent on one another as far as, interstate trade and stuff like that. With regards to transportation, under infrastructure, you're going to see the growth of roads being built. Roads such as the Cumberland Road, probably the most famous road built during this time. Canals like the Erie Canal are going to be made. Steamboats are going to be invented, like Robert Fulton is going to invent the steamboat. Railroads are going to start to become predominant in our country, all as a result of this desire to expand our national markets. We're going to see the communication revolution start with the introduction of the telegraph invented by Samuel Morse. Industry, as I said, is going to grow with factories, and we're going to start manufacturing. And one factory system you've got to be aware of is the Lowell system. The Lowell system was a model based on what Lowell saw over in England. He brought this over here, and the Lowell factory system is going to employ young girls in our country, where they're going to go live in a company town, and they're going to work at the Lowell factory, and they're going to send that money home to their parents. And so you start to see, and don't jump on this bandwagon that this modern wave of feminism is starting, but you do see women starting to take a little bit of a different role in society. And then, of course, another major part of the market revolution is all the new inventions that came out. I mentioned the telegraph and the steamboat, but probably the one that had the most effect, the most consequence, is going to be the invention of the cotton gin. And the cotton gin is essentially going to be, once that gets implemented down in the South and you start seeing the South start growing cotton as a cash crop, you're going to see the cotton gin have a direct effect on the demand for more land and the demand for more slave labor. And so that's going to start expanding our country. And you're also going to see, because of the American system, you're going to see some of the beginnings of essentially sectionalism starting in our country, because there is some competition for what we can, who gets what from the American system. And quite honestly, if you look at the structure of that system, the South kind of got left out. The West and the North benefited from the infrastructure. They benefited, the North especially benefited from the tariffs, but the South, they didn't get as much benefit from this. So you're going to start seeing some of this competition start to grow during this time period. And even though we're living in this high wave of nationalism, there is some division kind of starting to kind of rear its ugly head in our country. So let's talk now about, step outside of the United States real quickly and talk about foreign policy. Because what we're going to see during this time is James Monroe is going to come into office, and Monroe is going to introduce a new idea called the Monroe Doctrine. And when the Napoleonic Wars ended over in Europe, there was concern that the European countries would want to come here and reestablish their colonies. And, America didn't want that because we're establishing trade with a lot of the areas, the countries over here. So the Monroe Doctrine is going to be passed that says that the European countries must stay out of the Western Hemisphere. Now, it's interesting because we were still a small country, but how could such a small country have that kind of influence to keep European powers from coming over into this half of the world? And the simple fact was, England backed us up. And with England's backing, we're able to establish this role as essentially a protector of the Western Hemisphere. Another major foreign policy that's going to occur under the presidency of James Monroe is going to be the Adams-Onis Treaty. The Adams-Onis Treaty is essentially going to bring Florida into the United States with a trade with Spain during this time. Now, the one thing I want to talk, I'm not sure if I have it on a future slide, so I might have to circle back to this because I didn't double check the order here. So this is some of the foreign policy. I've already talked here about the market revolution. Sorry, I got a little bit out of order. I actually got ahead of myself. But as you can see here, this just kind of reiterates what I was already saying, that inventions like the cotton gin, the steam engine, and canals and stuff like that are going to bring our nation together, and we're going to start seeing the growth of other parts of our nation, like cities. That's going to be a major effect of the market revolution, along with the rise of a new economic class called the middle class. Okay? Let me move on to the next one, see what's next. I'll be as surprised as you are. When we look at the society, when we look at social impacts of the market revolution, as our country starts to grow, more opportunity starts to grow. As more opportunity starts to grow, word gets out, and we start to see immigrants coming to our country. And we're going to see specifically Irish and Germans coming into our country and starting to fuel our workforce, become a major part of our labor force. And due to that, we're going to see this wave of immigrants, and we're going to start seeing signs of nativism. When immigrants start coming in and competing for jobs, that's going to raise some, the competition is going to bring out not the best in some people. So nativism is slowly going to start to rear its ugly head during this time. I did mention the Lowell system, but when we talk about the Lowell system, I want to be clear, as I said, it's not this huge wave of feminism that's sweeping our nation, because the wave that's sweeping our nation with regards to women at this time is the cult of domesticity. And this cult of domesticity is going to create clear gender roles in our society, essentially developing the fact that women's role is to be in the home and to create a home that is safe for her family and her husband, and to create a family life that the husband's going to want to come home to every day, to make the home essentially the man's haven, if you will. And so women are going to be looked to create that home life, to raise the children, and to play that role in society. Oops, I hit that twice. We're going to see democracy start to expand during this time as well. The United States was doing really well economically during the market revolution, but we are going to see a downturn in our economy in the year of 1819. The Panic of 1819 is going to be caused by a number of effects, but a lot of the same things you see in other economic panics. You're going to see too much prospecting, buying things on the margin, land sales, people trying to buy land cheap and then sell it later for more expensive. And then there was a high demand for land, which drove up the price, but then the demand dropped. And so the price was driven down. And when you can't sell your land, you can't pay off your loans. When you can't pay off your loans, the banks start to close. And when the banks start to close, you can't get loans. And you just see this cycle of economic doom, if you will. And so the Panic of 1819 is going to hit, and that's going to have a major effect on democracy in our country. And you might be thinking, well, Lennox, how can you have this huge effect on the democracy when there's an economic panic? Simply this. When the economic panic hit, the common man who didn't have the right to vote at this time, essentially at this point in history, only property-owning white males had the right to vote. And what you're going to see happen is the Panic of 1819 was not discriminatory. It hit everybody. So a lot of the men in the country are like, why did this panic hit? Why didn't the government see it coming? What's going on? And so they find themselves saying, we have the right to say what's going on in our country, to know what's going on, and to have a voice. And they're going to start calling for more and more voting rights. And they're calling for the governments to remove property requirements from the voting laws. And we're going to start seeing that as we go into the 1820s. State by state is going to start removing property restrictions on voting rights. And so now, by the time we get to the end of the 1820s, you're going to see this universal white male suffrage where, own land or not, all white men can vote in America. So you see that by 1828, that becomes the big thing. Now in 1824, what we're going to see is the whole common man suffrage has not quite hit in. And so when we get to the election of 1824, you're going to have an election where you essentially have a number of candidates running against you. We're coming out of the era of good feelings in which we just had one political party. It was all Democratic Republicans. And going into the election of 1824, we have 4 separate candidates running, no real political parties, and we don't have one clear winner in the election. The man who got the most electoral votes was Andrew Jackson. The most popular votes was Andrew Jackson. But no one got the majority of the electoral votes. As a result of that, based on the Constitution, the House of Representatives determines who will be the next president. Well, Henry Clay was another candidate, and he was not going to win. So he is going to, basically influence his votes in the House to go to John Quincy Adams. As a result of that, Henry Clay is going to end up being the Secretary of State. A lot of people thought at the time, especially Jackson, that this was a corrupt bargain, that they had made this backroom deal where Clay had sold his votes for a position in the cabinet. What they did, what Adams and Clay did, there was nothing illegal about it, but it just rubbed Jackson the wrong way because he had the most votes. So Jackson is going to turn this around, and from 1824 on, he is going to go on this massive campaign for the election of 1828 because he does not want to lose again. And it's during those years when he's campaigning that all the states are starting to drop their property requirements. And and so you couple that with Jackson, and Jackson's going out appealing to the quote common man, saying, I'm just like you, I understand your frustration, and now the common man has the right to vote. You can see going into the election of 1828 where Jackson is going to actually win this election. He's known as the champion of the common man. And when Jackson comes in, we enter into this time period called Jacksonian democracy. And this whole time period, 1828 into the 1840s, kind of encapsulates Jacksonian democracy. Jackson's going to come into office, and what he's probably most well known for is expanding the power of the presidency. He says, as president, I should, be able to, rule. I should have power. It's not just an office where the title. I should be able to be an active president. And so he also believed in the spoils system. To the victor goes the spoils, and he's going to start appointing friends and stuff to office and to different positions. Probably the biggest fight he has during his presidency is the fight against rechartering the Second National Bank. The bank was established under the American system in 1816, and it's up to be renewed. It's a 20-year charter. Jackson hates the bank. He sees the bank as a tool of the rich. And so he wants to basically de-establish the bank. And so he vetoes the charter to renew it. And we're not going to have another national bank after this. And he's going to start moving the money from the national bank into state banks. You see, Jackson believed that more power should be in the states. He believed that the presidency should have power, but he also believed that the states should have power. And he believed that the state banks could better manage the money for the people. And so he's going to start moving money into the state banks. And this is going to cause a bit of a panic. And you're going to start seeing prices starting to rise. You're going to start seeing interest rates, being affected and stuff like that. And so through his presidency, Jackson's moving all this money around, but coming out of his presidency, what we're going to see is the United States is going to go through two more economic panics, the Panic of 37 and the Panic of 39. Another major part of Jackson's administration is going to be the nullification crisis. In 1828, before John Quincy Adams leaves office, he is going to sign into legislation a new tariff. It was the largest tariff in American history, and it's nicknamed the Tariff of Abominations. And what's going to happen is that the tariffs hurt the southern states because that takes away from their profits because they rely on trade. And if you put a tariff on one country, they're going to put a reciprocal tariff on us. And so the South is hurting from these tariffs, especially this huge tariff. And so South Carolina is going to nullify the tariff. Again, go back to the Virginia and the Kentucky resolutions when Jefferson and Madison argued that if a federal law hurts a state, that state has the right to nullify it or essentially wipe it off their books. And so South Carolina, it says they're going to nullify the tariff of 1828. And Jackson says, no, you're going to collect that tariff. And he actually gets Congress to pass the Force Bill. And the Force Bill gave Jackson federal power or federal authority to use the military to go to South Carolina to force them to collect the tariff. So Jackson marches the troops down to South Carolina. South Carolina is ready to go to fight. I mean, we almost have a civil war start right then. But in the end, Henry Clay is going to step in and say, let's just have a lower tariff. And we're going to see the reduction of the tariff. But the nullification crisis is important because even though the federal government passed a law to enforce the tariff, South Carolina still walked away thinking they still had the right to nullify laws. And that's going to come into play when we get into the 1850s and the 1860s. This idea of nullification just doesn't go away. And then finally, I think everybody knows Jackson for his relationship with the Native Americans. In 1831, he is going to, in 1830, there's going to be a law passed that's going to carry over into 1831 called the Indian Removal Act. This act was to move members of the civilized tribes, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Seminole, the Creek. They could move them to reservations in Oklahoma. And when that happened, the Cherokee, one of the civilized nations, are actually going to use the American courts to fight that. And that's when Worcester versus Georgia, which I mentioned earlier, that's when that court case comes into play. And John Marshall, basically Georgia was forcing the Cherokee out. And the Cherokee are going to sue to stay in Georgia. And Marshall is going to rule that the Native Americans are an independent nation. So Georgia doesn't have the authority of foreign policy. That's a federal authority. And so he is going to say, the federal government has to deal with this. Jackson wants nothing to do with it. The rumor is he said, if Marshall wants to make law, let him come down and enforce it because I'm not going to do it. What's going to end up happening is the long-term result of the Indian Removal Act and the Worcester versus Georgia court case is the Trail of Tears. Now, the Trail of Tears doesn't take place in Jackson's administration. It takes place under Van Buren. However, it is a direct result of the Indian Removal Act. Okay, so keep that in mind. An American identity is going to be created during this time, and this is really important. I think period 4 is when America kind of finds out who she is, and then, in discovering who she is. Sorry, I heard a funny noise outside. Discovering who she is, she develops this identity. And you're going to see that identity come to fruition through writers, through artists, and through philosophies. And I have them up here. Noah Webster is going to create the Webster's Dictionary, which is an American dictionary. And we're going to see American writers start to come out during this time. And these American authors, their stories are going to spread worldwide. The Hudson River School, an art institute that started painting uniquely American designs. I mean, landscapes and portraits and stuff like that identified an American view. But it was all centered around this idea of transcendentalism. This transcendentalist movement is going to come out during this time, and the transcendentalist movement is going to not only inspire art, it's not only going to inspire writings and stuff, it's going to inspire a reform movement. The transcendentalist movement is going to occur at about the same time that the Second Great Awakening is occurring. Second Great Awakening was a religious revival that spread throughout our country. And this revival is going to spread from north to south to west. So it touched the entire country. And from the Second Great Awakening, what we learned was that it was that the individuals have the power to make society better. And so the Second Great Awakening says, as Christians, we should be going out and sharing the love of Jesus with others. And we'll do that, in doing that, we'll make society better. And where we see failures in society, we should work to reform those failures. So you're going to see a reform movement spread up from this. The transcendentalists are also talking about the power of the individual. While they're not connected to faith or religion, they see the strength of the individual. So both of these movements work in concert to start this American individualism, and that also spurs on the reform movement, where we're going to see the abolitionist movement rise up, the temperance movement rise up, and also the women's movement rise up. Charles Finney is probably a name you want to know from the Second Great Awakening, but dive into it a little bit. Look at the leaders of the different reform movements. Look at the leaders of the women's movement, the abolition movement, the William Lloyd Garrisons, and the newspaper he wrote. These are the things you want to dive into, fill in the blanks with this. But understand that the Second Great Awakening and the Transcendentalist movement inspired this reform movement that's going to carry us into the 1850s. Another part of the reform movement where it was this growth of utopian societies, where if society as a whole is not perfect, why don't we just create our own perfect society? And so you're going to see these societies like the Oneidas and the Shakers start to try to develop a perfect society. You're going to see new religions come out, such as the Mormons, and they're going to they're going to start migrating west and join that Manifest Destiny movement. And as I mentioned, some other reform movements that are going to come out is prison, education, mental asylums. All of this geared towards making the American society better. And now it is uniquely and definitely an American society that we're living in. We have broken away from the English influence that we once had. I got the wrap up, but I do want to go back and let me get back to this screen, because I totally skipped over something that is very important. Give me just a second here. Let me go over here. And I want to talk to you briefly about a major piece of legislation that took place in 1820, and that's going to be the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise is going to be passed under James Monroe, and I'm sorry I skipped it. I had it in my notes, but I didn't have it on my slides. The Compromise of 1850 was a result of the expansion of America. So we expanded land holdings with the Louisiana Purchase. We also expanded land holdings with the Purchase, or with the Adams-Onis Treaty and Florida. You're also going to see the Market Revolution kick off. And I mentioned one of the major contributors to the market revolution is the invention of the cotton gin. So the cotton gin is allowing more production of cotton, and I told you that the more production of cotton required more land and more slave labor. So what's going to start happening is you're going to start seeing more expansion west. Well, the question is going to come up. Will slavery be able to expand with the rest of the country? And the big debate is going to come up when Missouri tries to enter the Union. As a result of Missouri trying to come in as a slave state, and it's not about the debate over slavery, but if Missouri came in as a slave state, that would upset the balance of equality in the Senate. Because before Missouri, you had an equal number of slave states and free states. And Missouri coming in as a slave state would upset that balance. So this is what the debate's about. It's not about the question of slavery. It's about power. And so the Missouri Compromise is going to be passed, one of our first pieces of legislation dealing with the question of the expansion of slavery. And essentially, it created a geographical line, the 3630 line, that we were going to use going forward to determine where slave states would be allowed and where free states would be allowed. We knew we were going to add more states, but we wanted to essentially get ahead of it. The problem was that we didn't get ahead of it. We just kicked the can down the road. The Missouri Compromise was a Band-Aid on an evil that was growing in our country. And instead of dealing with it in that moment, we said, we'll just deal with it later. We'll solve it for now. I mentioned to the review this afternoon, Thomas Jefferson referred to the Missouri Compromise as the death knell of the Union. A death knell, Knell, is like a funeral bell. And he said the Missouri Compromise is the beginning of the end of our country. He said because we're not dealing with the slavery question. And we have to deal with it. If we're not willing to deal with it now, it's going to get worse down the road. So that Missouri Compromise is very important, especially going into our next unit. It solved the problem for Unit 4, but it doesn't solve the problem for America going forward. So I'm going to go ahead and start wrapping this up. What I want to do, though, now is give you guys the opportunity to ask questions. And again, it's the questions that's going to drive your learning. I can sit here and I can talk, but if you're not going to be part of the conversation, it makes it a little difficult. So here's the thing. Unit 4 was about the transformation of our nation. We became more democratic, we became economically independent, and we started to reform our society towards certain goals. As a result of that, we're going to see tensions starting to grow in our country. These tensions over slavery are going to start to grow. But it's not just tensions over slavery, it's tensions over the regional differences in our country and the different goals of our country. So this sectionalism, what we're looking at essentially is North versus West versus South. And what is that going to lead to going forward? Okay, so that's Unit 4 in a nutshell. And I don't know how long I've even been talking. I haven't even been looking at the timer here. I've been talking for 35 minutes, 37 minutes, much longer than I expected. But that's where we're at. I don't see any questions coming up. Dana, you're more than welcome. I'm happy to do this. But I'm going to go ahead and get, pull down the PowerPoint, because once I pull down the PowerPoint, I'm just about done. Go back to my main screen and say, all right, a few more seconds, I'll pet the dog. And if that's all you guys got and you got no questions, I'm telling you what, for my students who are watching now, the American system successful, Julia? Yeah, it was. That's a great question. It was successful because we saw America become economically independent. And even though I built up the sectionalism a lot, but we became independent economically from the rest of the world, and we became interdependent on one another. So we were, trading with one another, we were working with one another, but we were still competing with one another. The bank, for 20 years helped, our the nation. The tariffs were helping to an extent. It wasn't helping the South. But yeah, I think, you can pick, if I had to pick one part of the American system, I would say infrastructure. That was a huge contribution to the success of our nation. And that infrastructure is just going to continue to grow and grow and grow in the North and the West. In the South, not as much. And we'll see. We know what happens in the South with their lack of infrastructure. But that's for time period 5. That's our next time period. But that's a good question. All right. Any other questions? I did a little bit better with the coughing tonight. All right, my friends. I know our numbers were a little bit lower tonight because I know the spring show was tonight and tomorrow night. So shout out to all my ladies out there who are dancing right now. But hopefully you'll be able to watch this on the replay. Other than that, guys, I hope you have a great evening, and we will see you tomorrow night. I'll be back on tomorrow night, same time, 7:30, and I'll be talking about time period 5. So you guys have a great evening, and we will see you later. Good night.